So it's not just a matter of I'm not using a partnership, therefore so-and-so can't do whatever. Ultimately, if you come together, there has to be that element of trust, which is so important. This is why it's important to get that purpose right at the beginning and understand the goals and values of the people that you're going into business with. So the next thing is getting stuff into the business. So we've decided to do something together, and one of the reasons is we're going to be pooling some resources, so we need to make contributions. So your initial contributions can be one of three things. They can be equity, they can be debt, or they can be non-monetary contributions, so things that you need to do for the enterprise. And non-monetary contributions can be real property going in, they can be plant and equipment, goodwill or a business opportunity or an idea, something like that, some confidential information, intellectual property, and then time and energy. Sometimes you see that two people go into business, someone with the money and the business acumen and the other person with the time and energy. The problem with that is that you need to be able to measure contributions, and you need to be able to put in place, or you need to have agreed what are the consequences if those contributions don't go in. Is there a change in equity? Do you get expelled? You need to really think about that at the outset. And where people go wrong is most people define contributions or don't take the time to define them well enough, and they're in dispute even before the thing's got off the ground, because one person thinks they've put in what they need to put in and the other person thinks that they clearly haven't. So you really want to avoid that. Intellectual property's got its own sort of slide because it's quite important to identify what's going in and who owns that, whether it's a contribution. So in a lot of cases people come with an idea or some intellectual property, and the formality of getting that intellectual property into the joint enterprise isn't actually perfected. So there's a dispute as to who owns the intellectual property when the thing blows up. Then there's intellectual property that's generated in the business itself. And once again, the sort of basic position is it's owned by the common business enterprise, which might not be what you intend. It may be that when the people go their own way, that someone always intended for that intellectual property to go with them. So you need to think about those three aspects of intellectual property. So you've got your purpose, you've come together, you've looked at what you're going to put in, and then the next question is who's going to get what? How much are you giving away to actually involve these people in the business? And what are you getting? People generally overvalue ideas, particularly people with ideas and no cash, and undervalue cash. And it also surprises me that people with cash undervalue cash. The amount of equity that people give away, or cash that people give away to get involved in ideas staggers me. And they don't necessarily put in place the clawbacks that if those ideas or that time and energy don't actually come to the fore. So when people say, well, how much should each person get? They say, management, they should get 5 or 10%, shouldn't they? And so-and-so is going to get 50% or 40%. And I say back to them, it's actually not that simple. It's a valuation exercise. So you need to value what's already there, particularly if you've already got a business and someone's coming into it. And then you need to say, well, what are the things that we can easily value, the cash and the assets and those sort of things? What are they worth and who's contributing those before you start to get to the concept of this time and energy? And then you need to apply risk weighting. What are the risks of this thing actually working or not working? And what's the market value of those contributions? This is when it gets hard. So valuation is really hard. People will give away cash, give away equity, because they don't want to go through the hard process of determining real value. But you really do have to sit down and do the calculation so that 6 months down the track, there's not that bitter taste in your mouth that you've given away too much equity or you haven't got enough equity. So this concept of future value, we're going into business, we're striking particular, you're going to get 40%, so-and-so is going to get 60%. But a lot of the reasons that we come together in a common business enterprise is to generate future value, to generate new value, to bring ideas to market, whatever it might be. So we need to deal with this concept of future value and adjustments in the process. And my sort of starting point is that you shouldn't pay for future value until it's arrived. So the concept of using things like options, for tax considerations, you might actually give the person the equity up front and then have part of that equity forfeited if that future value doesn't arise. And the reason for that is that the forfeiting of value, it's easy to give someone 50% up front of something that's worth $1 because there's not a lot of tax consequences. And if they don't perform, it can then get scaled down to 40%, 30%. The scaling down is not going to be a problem. Whereas if you use the traditional options where you say, okay, I've got 100% of it, and if you deliver, I'm then going to give you 20%. Well, by the time you've delivered, you've created value, and that giving of the 20% is going to create tax issues. So That's sort of getting a little bit complicated on the tax side of it, but the concept is that generally don't pay for future value until it's arrived. This is a really important one. I guess I've got a current experience in one of my businesses about an inconsistency of approaches in relation to growth. So I went into a business and it's 50-50, and the partner I've gone into is the active partner, or the business I've gone to, this guy's the active partner, and I want it to grow. I think there's a really good opportunity for it at the moment, given where the current market is in real estate. But he actually doesn't have the cash to match my cash. So the only alternative there is that he gets diluted, but that's not, he's got an obsession around 50%, and fine, he wants to be an equal partner in that business. So what we failed to do there is we failed to talk about what was our strategy around growth and plan for that as part of how the business would go, and what the expectations would be around dilution and the addition of additional cash. So there's a couple of fallacies around ownership interests that people fixate on. Some people think that if I've got greater than 50%, if I've got 51%, I control it. And that may be the case to some extent, but if you've carefully crafted the way the business is structured, you're probably going to have the concepts of simple majority decisions, where you will control those decisions, or you can put the boots on and ultimately prevail. But then you'll have these concepts of a special majority, which might be 75%, an extraordinary majority, where that's generally 75% of all the equity holders, not just the people participating in that particular decision. Unanimity, which is where everybody has to agree, and then a veto. A veto is actually different to unanimity. Basically, you can have everybody agreeing, and one person says no. That's a veto in relation to unanimity. But you can also have a veto in relation to a simple majority. And we're not going to get into too much complexity there, but vetoes are quite powerful things, and people with money, financiers, tend to have certain vetoes. So if you go into a common business enterprise with a private equity provider, they'll be focused around particular vetoes. They won't want you to do certain things unless they agree, otherwise they're going to let you run the business. And then overlying that, you've got the oppression in the Corporations Act, and you've got fiduciary duties, which means that you need to take into account the other person's considerations under both the Trustee Act and the Partnership Act. So more than 50% won't be enough. You need to think about these other issues. The other one is the 50-50 fallacy. People think, oh, it's great, we're going to be equal, it's going to be even. But every business needs a boss, even if you're 50-50 in equity. And most businesses have a natural boss. So rather than hide from the issue and pretend that you're not the guy out front, just embrace it. It's not probably going to be such a big issue if that's brought out at the outset. And this really comes down to this separation of ownership and participation. So you might own 50%, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be involved in every day-to-day decision of that particular business. If the business needs something, so you've talked about who's going to contribute and who's going to get what up front. But what's invariably going to happen is the business is going to need something else down the track. And this is surprisingly rarely looked at, and it's where a lot of issues come from. So who's going to decide, this is this issue I was having in this real estate business, who's going to decide what our growth model is? Who's going to make those decisions about, we need more money, or we need more people, or we need to involve more plant equipment, or we need to expand into different markets? Is it going to be a majority, or does everybody have an equal say in that? And the other thing is, how are we going to put those additional resources in? Is it going to be equity and debt, or debt? And do we have an agreed sort of debt-equity ratio in form of gearing? So a lot of people like to put debt in first, because it doesn't raise the issue of reallocating equity. But the actual decision of whether you're going to put in debt and equity, if you haven't decided that up front by agreeing on some sort of a gearing ratio, it's going to lead to a dispute. Preemption rights, I think people mostly think about preemption rights in the concept of, I've got equity and I want to sell it, I've first of all got to offer it to my other business people. But there's also preemption rights on issue, on the creation of new equity. So this is sometimes left out of company constitutions. If the directors want to issue new shares, there should be something in the agreements that says that they need to offer those new shares to the existing shareholders in proportion to their existing shareholdings. So that someone who's controlling the decision in relation to granting more equity can't then grant themselves a lot more and dilute the other person down. So that concept of preemption, the right to participate in pro rata in new equity and debt, you should look for that in the agreements. And the concept of dilution. A lot of people are really fixated about dilution, and You know, I think that the guys in Silicon Valley are pretty comfortable with dilution as long as the pie is growing. So, you know, do you want I think I've got a slide on this. Do you want a smaller slice of a bigger pie, or do you want to maintain your particular equity interest? But ultimately, a lot of these issues can be solved by valuation, by agreeing on valuation. So if you're going to get diluted, provided that the person putting more money in is putting it in at a value that doesn't really dilute the value of your holding, you're probably going to be less concerned. So the concept of valuation, how valuation is arrived at, is very important. That's really the concept of, you know, growing the pie. And I think that where dilution upsets people is that it conflicts with control. So you're happy for the pie to get bigger and slices of the pie to go, but then you hit these key thresholds, 50%. So first of all, if you've got 25%, you can block a special resolution. So if you drop below 25%, you might start getting a bit concerned there that you're really just a minority. You know. Then the other guy might be getting towards 50%. So you're thinking, well, there's going to be a lot of decisions that can be controlled by this person. Then they get to above 75%. Suddenly they're controlling special decisions. And then you get past that and the sort of pendulum swung the other way. So I think dilution and control and valuation are really all part of that matrix in working out how the business is going to be funded if it needs more resources. The other thing that you should think about, and this is sort of a cousin of those issues, is if someone else wants to come in, can you be forced to go into business with somebody that wasn't anticipated at the outset? So that's obviously, you know, once again, at what value and who gets to make those decisions. So that brings us to the next issue that you really need to focus on. And once again, I guess they're all important, but the controls are one that a lot of disputes arise out of. And I think the reason is that most entrepreneurs and people who actually get business goings are A-type control freaks. You know, they really want to make all the decisions. They don't like letting go. And I think the way you can get over that is to break it down into 2 levels, or at least 2 levels. So, well, actually 3 levels. So at the top, you've got your ownership interest, call that the owner's hat. Then in the middle, you've got the board. So you've got the higher level strategy, setting the direction of the enterprise. And then you've got management, that's turning up each day. So where things go wrong, I think, is that you go into business with people and you don't recognise which hat you're wearing when you're coming together to make decisions. So you just have your monthly meeting, someone starts talking about the fact that this machine's broken down, someone starts talking about the fact that we need more money, someone talks about the fact that they're not getting on with so-and-so, and they've just worn their 3 hats within the same sentence often. And you can't make good decisions and you can't actually apply those control and decision thresholds in that sort of a forum. It's confused. So you need to deliberately spend time and provide for spending time and make the right decisions in the right forum. So that might mean in your partnership agreement, instead of saying, we're going to have a meeting every month, you say, we're going to have an operational meeting every week. Then we're going to have a board or a strategic meeting once a month, once every 2 months. And then we're going to have an owners and an equity holders meeting every 6 months or 12 months. And we're deliberately not going to raise the issues in relation to being an owner of this business when we meet at our weekly operational meeting. It's a simple strategy that I think really promotes good control and good decision making within your business. So we've already talked about the decision thresholds. So you need to say, well, what decisions are we going to be making at those particular forums? And the way I do that, I've got a checklist, and we go through all the decisions, and we say, in which forum are we going to be making these decisions? And what's going to be the level of decision? So is it going to be a simple majority, a special majority, unanimity? Who's going to have a veto? So we've got a control or a decision-making matrix around the things that come up. And you don't have to be a genius or have been involved in many businesses to know what those decisions are going to be, what the things you're going to need to think about within each forum. Deadlock is something that I think lawyers spend a lot of time on. They love drafting long clauses, referring things to independent people and rotating chairmanships and all this sort of rubbish. Sorry?
Does it ever happen?
No.
Independent people?
No, absolutely. And the last thing you want, there is no such thing as an independent person when you're in dispute. I don't know if anybody's ever found one. I've never found one. I've always found some very reasonable people, and I've always found some very unreasonable people, depending on what side of the debate I'm on, but never an independent person. And so, ultimately, in relation to deadlock, you have 2 choices. You either choose who's the boss, or you lock it up until somebody compromises. Now, if anybody can come up with any other workable solution for deadlocks, then that's great. But I think they are ultimately the two that ultimately work. And you need to choose a boss up front, so you need to know what decision you're going to be making if you're going to go with option A. I often go with option B, which is compromise on the day. In other words, there is no way to break the deadlock other than you blowing the business up and destroying the value that you're creating jointly and making that choice, or coming up with some sort of compromise on the day. Now, this is the one that really is the thing that blows up most common business enterprises. First of all, will you work in the business? This is this concept of, is it a real business? Do you have to work in the business, and to what extent? Can you go into business and then say, no, I'm not really interested, I'm going surfing, but I'm still going to hold my 50%, thanks very much. And if that's not right, if you need to be there for 100% of the time, or 75% full-time equivalent, or 50% full-time equivalent, you need to agree that up front, because that will, the day-to-day contribution, so-and-so's not working hard enough, I'm working on the weekends, but they're not working on the weekends. That's the thing that's going to boil up and ultimately blow the thing up. Can you supply to the enterprise is the next thing. That's Solomon Lee, by the way. I think he had some difficulties with supplying some stuff to Maya. And got chucked off the board for the concept of that conflict. So you need to agree, are you going to be able to supply, and what are market terms, and who's going to determine market terms? So my guys last week, these 3 guys, 2 of them, well actually all 3 of them are going to be supplying stuff to this enterprise. And one's going to be doing sort of IP marketing stuff, another guy's going to be putting in the connections for goods which are going to be bought and sold, and the other guy's going to be working in sort of accounting sort of thing. So they're all putting into the business, even though they're not sort of working in it full time, there's not that expectation. And so I was saying to them, well, on what terms can you do that? Are you going to pay the guy a wage who's going to be in there X days a week doing the books? How are you going to make sure you're going to supply it at wholesale, retail, a blend between wholesale and retail? What happens if this guy can get discounts on stuff because he's buying a lot of stuff over here? Does he get the benefit of that and pass it on at normal wholesale, or does he pass on the cost to him? All those issues, because they're the sort of things, these little niggly things that just build up and blow up your business. So really the bigger thing there is, can you have a conflict of interest? And if you can have a conflict of interest, when do you need to disclose that conflict of interest? Once again, all of these things, we're trying to take issues off the table that are ultimately going to destroy the business before it can become valuable and you can get an exit. That's all these issues about preempting problems. And then can you vote if you've got a conflict? So can you participate in the forum with the hat on as the owner or the manager or the director? Can you participate in the discussion? Maybe not, because sometimes it's better to not have the person in there when you make those decisions. And then can you vote on it? So once again, you want to agree those things. And this is the hoariest chestnut of them all. Can family be involved in business? Now, who thinks that family should be involved in partnerships? That's good, all right. So you've probably been bored for the last half an hour because you probably know everything then. Because if you know that, that is the #1 issue for blowing up a business. Get Jimmy involved. Or get your spouse to do the books. They are the 2 things that blow up businesses. Now you can agree about it up front, and it doesn't just blow up personal partnerships. Think about News Corporation. The difficulty, the cost when certain equity raiders have come into Murdoch's businesses and extorted money out of Murdoch, basically on the basis that Murdoch was making decisions around family succession and not necessarily with his eye firmly on the ball as far as doing equity transactions. Another one, this guy's another one of my sort of semi-heroes, not so much as the Wright brothers, but he's up there, that's Henry Ford. And he needed some money, he went into a number of partnerships along the way. One of them was with the Dodge brothers. It's a famous case in America where the Dodge brothers sued Henry Ford because Henry Ford was making good money. He went through ups and downs, but at this stage he was making some good money. And he wanted to invest it in social housing for his workers and wanted every person to be able to drive around in one of his black cars. And the Dodge brothers wanted some profit. They wanted some distributions. And the reason they wanted some distributions is because they didn't actually think that everybody should drive a black Model T. They wanted something which was fashionable and cool and had different colours and big fins and stuff. So they wanted to go their own way, but Henry Ford wouldn't give them any money. So they took Henry Ford to court, and ultimately there was a settlement where they were effectively bought out. But the profit distribution, agreeing on profit distribution is really important. And it's important because some people need that profit to pay interest on the debt that they've borrowed on their own account to actually participate in equity in the business. So do spend time and agree on those things up front. Employees are another important issue. And it is the biggest, as I said, probably emphasise this on a number of occasions now. But it is one of the things, this personal time contribution and that expectation around participation in the business that causes so many of the disputes. And I think a lot of those disputes, funnily enough, can be solved by valuation. If everybody's getting, people say, oh, no, I don't need a salary, it's all good, a lot of love here, we're all going to go, we're all going to roll up our sleeves and it's all going to go well. That's great for the first 3 months. And then this inequality of contribution comes in, time and energy. It's the most valuable thing, our own personal time. Doesn't matter how much money you've got, your personal time is ultimately the most valuable thing to you. And you want to be compensated for it, and you take it very personally at any level. So I say to people, the best way to avoid these disputes is to provide for, when you've got your employee hat on, get paid a market value for what you do. And by the way, just because you're a really fancy person who can earn $700,000 a year as an investment banker, doesn't mean you're worth $700,000 a year when you're running the local restaurant. So look at the value of what you're contributing to that particular business. Rich people, successful people love to dabble in other businesses, but they still think they're carrying that value with them. They're not. And for those employees who aren't participating in ownership, you need to be a little bit nice to them. They need a boss, and they only need one boss. They don't need 2 bosses, they don't need 3 bosses. Like children. Anyway, I'm not going to go there. So we need to establish areas of responsibility and reporting lines. It's a obvious one if you're running a business, but it's not obvious if you're running a business in common with other people. Everybody wants to be everybody else's boss. Who can hire and fire employees? I just got fired. Oh, well, I just hired you again. Who's going to set and review salary levels? So usually that's done by people who aren't reporting directly. So the person that reports to you gives a report on you, and then the other people decide what you get paid. So there's that check and balance, so that you're not saying, oh, you're overpaying them, because they're reporting to you, and you've got your little team going here, and you're creating your own little power cell. Once again, will related parties be allowed to come in? And if they do, then you've got to go to that next level as far as who's going to be setting those things with that little bit more care. Okay, so we get to the stage where we've got everything in, we've grown the business, and someone wants to get out. The first thing about getting out is that it's usually, other than when it's in dispute, but even then, disputes are usually caused by something outside the business. It's something external, it's something personal. People need money outside, they want to get a bigger house. Spouse moves interstate, something goes wrong in the family, someone has to look after a parent. It's those things that generally take people off course and precipitate someone having to exit or maybe reduce their involvement in the business. Might be health. Health's another one. So we've got a change in equity here, and fundamentally for the people who are left in, because we're focusing on the business here, not the person who needs to leave at this stage, it's a question of who are you going to be in business with. So ultimately, if someone sells equity in the business, to what extent do you participate in the decision about who you're going to be in business with? So you have all these concepts. We've got permitted transfers. I'm going to go through a few of these. Preemption rights, tag-alongs, drag-alongs. I remember the first time I was shown, this was when I was working in London, this little private equity law firm, and I came across these tag-along and drag-along and exit rights. I thought they were the coolest thing ever. I hadn't heard of them before, and they're very common now in Australia, but I certainly hadn't come across them before, so I'll just go into those things shortly. And then the other issues that often come up when I'm talking with people about going into business is, are they going to be able to say no at the end of the day? Even if someone dies and the shares are going to the son or the daughter, or the preemption rights have all been gone through and we've thrown paper all over the place to try and go through these preemption rights, and ultimately the person coming in we just don't like. Can we say no, even if we've gone through that process? So this is a permitted transfer. I can sell to whoever I like. Now, permitted transfer is a right in the holder of equity. they're the ones that hold that right. It's for their benefit. And that's usually, it might be to the super fund, to a company which I control 90%, to certain family members, to my next of kin when I die, etc. So it's a permitted transfer. You don't have to come back for permission. The next thing is preemption rights, which I'm sure we're all comfortable with and familiar with. So I want to sell to X, but I first have to offer it to my existing common business enterprise participants. And that's a right in the continuing people to decide who they're going to be in business with, or at least give them the opportunity, and also give them the opportunity in proportion to the equity that they already have, so all those control issues remain static. The next one is that if a certain majority of people want to sell, then they can't sell unless they also procure the same deal for the minority. So 75% want to sell, they've got to get an offer for 100%, and that's a protection for a minority, because once you sell 50%, you've sold what's called a control premium. And the full control premium will be paid to the people who are disposing 50% or more. So that leaves the person hanging there with their 5 or 10 or 15 or 20%, and they're never going to get that control premium or participate in their short share. In fact, they're going to be hit with a minority discount. So you've got people getting a much disproportionate share, higher share of the enterprise value on the exit. And the opposite to that is that these guys want to sell, 75% want to sell, and the buyer will only buy 100%. So the minority goes, well, that's great, but I don't really want to sell unless I get 120 cents in the dollar. So you need to give me some money, green mail, basically. So we have the drag-along provision, as opposed to the tag-along, which was the slide before, which is a protection for the majority that they can't be green mailed. So that's an important thing to have in there. And finally, an exit right is that I want to sell and you have to buy me. It's a put option. And exit rights are a good idea if, when you go into business, part of the purpose of going into business is to facilitate an exit from maybe an older partner. So if you don't agree that up front and when that's going to happen and give that person the right, then the purpose for which you're going into business won't be fulfilled, and there'll be an argument. So when these transactions happen, valuation raises its head again. And you've got the various options. You can agree the valuation up front. You can peg it to market and then determine some basis of determining market, whether it be one or two external valuers. It can be set by the vendor. So the vendor says, I want to sell my share and I'm going to sell it to Joe Blow for $10. The other guys go, well, I've got a preemption right here, but I think $10 is too much. They go, well, I've actually got someone who's going to pay $10. Well, I still think it's too much. So in a lot of constitutions and shareholders agreements, you see the ability for the directors or the continuing people to say, it's just still too much, we're going to go to an independent value anyway, or we're going to determine the valuation on some sort of set methodology that's less than $10. So I think it's obviously important to agree on not just the mechanism for transfer, the preemption, the tag along, the drag along, but the value and how that's going to be determined. And the more prescriptive you can be, the less chance there's going to be an argument. There's also a number of other exit events which you also want to contemplate, and it might be that you contemplate these in the sort of the normal agreements, or you might have a specific buy-sell deed or something like that to deal with these particular events, because some of them can be funded by insurance. Death, disability, trauma, ceasing to work a certain percentage time fixed from time equivalent, divorce, bankruptcy, dispute, those sort of things. So you might want to talk about, well, if these things happen, are they triggers for potential exits or expulsions of partners? And finally, the one that, as I was saying last week, was, if I can't get a dispute going in a meeting between prospective business partners, I get really disappointed. So I bring this one up, and it's generally quite effective in getting them thinking. But basically, we just don't like you anymore, so you're out. It's called an expulsion right. And my view on these things is, I think they're actually a good idea, because ultimately, if there's a breakdown in a relationship, what will happen if you don't have this is that everybody will go to court, they'll lawyer up, they'll spend several $100,000 each, and ultimately what the court says in 9 out of 10 times is, you need to buy this person out at fair market value. So they've spent, and every single time there's one of these disputes, they lawyer up, they go through all the documents and look at all these different rights and obligations, but ultimately, either in mediation or when the court makes a decision, that's the answer. So my view is, if you get to a position where you don't want to be in business with this person any longer, or the majority of you don't, why not have the ability to get rid of them at full fair market value? Anybody have a view on that? Who's in favour of that as a concept?
A discounted market.
Discount, you want a discount? We don't like you and you're out and you're at a discount. Yeah.
But normally that person would be causing problems with the business because that's the only reason you normally expel at that level. So have you seen in your experience some sort of discount in that area?
The discount.
Not to misbehave.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
to
So
misbehave, you get less.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're misbehaving, then a discount is usually a good idea. I think that's the next slide. Well, actually, I think it's one after this, but it's a good point because if you misbehave and you can define what that event is, then I think the ability to expel somebody at a discount is a good idea because it's like a liquidated damages. You're agreeing that you're only going to get 90% or 70% or 85% because you're causing us grief. The problem with that is that you need to agree very clearly what those things are which constitute misbehaviour. So if you can do that, then that's really a trigger for an expulsion that is relatively easy to implement. Just a plain expulsion right, we don't like you anymore, you're out, is usually at full value because it's just a personality issue. So I agree with what you're saying as far as the discount, but if we're talking about a pure expulsion right, just getting rid of someone because you don't like them anymore, my view is full value is probably, full fair value is probably closer to the mark unless, as I say, you can define that event. We've got a question?
I always recommend that you have a exit strategy before you start a business.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah, so talking about understanding what people's timeframes are and actually having a formal exit strategy. These are all sort of components of an exit strategy that you can put together to create a document along those lines that really deals with these particular potential events. So I also agree there. So when there is an exit and the value's been determined and it's been paid out, usually that value incorporates something referable to goodwill or the ability to use the assets that you've just bought on an ongoing basis to earn money and earn a return. And in order to protect that right, you would want to agree up front on restraints on the person who's left, who's just put some cash in their bank, from then using that cash and using the knowledge they have about the particular industry you're in from competing with you. So the things that I usually look to is saying, well, does the value reflect goodwill? And if it does, then a restraint's appropriate. So if I see goodwill anywhere, I usually look for a corresponding restraint. And then there's types of restraints. So there's the solicitation, which means going and talking to people and actively pulling business in. You can't do that, but you could do the business if it came to you. So solicitation is not a prohibition on competition, it's a prohibition on going out and trying to get customers that you've had for the other business. A competition restraint is just you cannot, within the area or for the particular period of time, compete. So even if someone comes to you out of the blue, you can't compete, you can't provide them services. So it's a much higher level of restraint. And then there's some other things I usually put in a restraint, which is the inability to poach former employees, because that's the first thing someone does when they want to go and get their money back. And then the other one is to interfere with suppliers. And that can be either getting supplies from the same supplier. So I had a client who was in the furniture business, and they had a supply agreement with a US supplier of particular furniture items. And one of them went off and basically got the same agreement mirrored in a new structure. And obviously a lot of the value of that business was the ability to supply those particular goods from that particular manufacturer in the US. So a restraint really needs to cover what's coming into the business, being suppliers and employees, and then what's going out in the concept of customers of the existing business versus even competing in the same market.